Here's a story you may have heard. There once was a well-intentioned CEO who threw a summer party for their team. There was barbecue, there was music, there was, of course, alcohol. And by Monday morning, there were also 3 HR reports, a sprained ankle, and an awkward question from payroll. Was that on the clock? This is what we do as human beings. We create culture. We gather, we celebrate, we encourage people to be themselves. But somewhere between intention and outcome, things get complicated. A conversation in the break room spirals into a political standoff. A request for a flexible schedule touches off a chain reaction of precedent and policy. And today, we're looking at the invisible line HR walks every day, that line between engagement and exposure, between keeping people happy and keeping the organization safe. To help us map that line, we're joined by Tom Jones and Steve Pangione from AIM HR Solutions. Tom brings the legal lens, Steve brings the people perspective, and together they help us explore one of the most important and difficult questions in modern work. How do we build a workplace people love without setting metaphorical fire to everything that keeps it standing? I'm Pete Wright. Welcome to Human Solutions. Tom, Steve, I'm so glad about this set of questions today. I think these are great questions, and my goodness, have we lived through them. So let's start with the CEO backyard celebration. We've got the drinks flowing. The vibe is super cash until someone trips or someone overshares and HR gets that Monday morning headache. Tom, we're going to start with the legal lens. What are the key risks leaders may be overlooking when they're planning this off-site company party, especially at someone's home?
There's this whole concept of what they call social host liability.
I've never even heard of those words. I think you're making them up on the spot.
No, trust me, I'm not, unfortunately. This concept in negligence law that says you hosted people, therefore, and something happened with alcohol, something happened with inappropriate. Oh, probably not more alcohol than anything else. Someone drives home, there's an accident, or some other thing as a result of the alcohol they took at your party. The risk is out there that somehow you're, as the host, going to be responsible for that. If they hit a car on the way home, something like that, and there's not even somebody hurt, rather there was damage, and it was clearly attributable to the alcohol-influenced driving. That would be one of the problems. Or workers' comp would be another.
So let's jump into the specifics there. What kinds of liability does the company still hold, even if the event is voluntary? Any?
Well, that helps. If it's voluntary, minimize some of the consequences, because you can at least push people toward the idea of saying you're free to come, you were free not to come. It minimizes some of the issues around workers' comp, around other situations. But let Steve go on, build on that if he wants.
All right, Steve, what do you got?
I agree with Tom that making it voluntary makes it a lot easier from a perspective as far as overtime pay and all of that. But it also depends on the purpose of the event. If it is, just a summer event, thanking everybody for a job well done, that's one thing. If it's a celebration of a product release, then it's a different vibe altogether.
Is there an obvious switch there that says it's a product release? That's definitely paid. That's company liability, everything. If it's, hey, we're all great, this is definitely team building, that's something completely different?
Yes. Well, I don't know from the legal perspective per se, but what I'm saying from the intent perspective, if people come in with the intent that this is going to be, a celebration of the product launch, and so it's going to be rah-rah company and very company focused, then it's going to be, go towards that direction. If this is just a celebration, let's party and have a great time because our company is doing well, it's going to create a totally different vibe at the party. And when you have that relaxed vibe, that's when people get into some problems.
And you want to make it crystal clear that the voluntary participation. If it turns out Pete was a star athlete in high school or college over volleyball, I want him on my team, I compel you to play, and you were happily sitting down and eating lunch, That's the sort of thing. Then you pull a muscle, you do something while you're playing. You might say, well, gee, I felt forced to do that, and that may be a workers' comp issue.
Or actually, the exact opposite might happen. If Pete is the pro and he is on a team, then he might get very upset, possibly abusive with the people on his team who aren't pros.
Let me just assure you both, there is zero risk of this happening.
It's all fun and games till someone gets hurt.
Super seriously. And
very seriously.
It's great for a competitive advantage, but that can create some really bad problems if you start screaming and yelling, how could you miss that, you bozo? How could you, people can get very emotional especially during sporting competitions. So it can go one way or the other. You can be forced to participate, or you can want to participate, but there's this jerk who's playing that you want to have nothing to do with.
True.
Yeah. I want to look at the idea of intention a little bit more closely, behind team bonding. I mean, clearly you've heard stories and dealt with issues of people getting abusive in sports activities, but what's the other side of that? The risk of people feeling excluded or ostracized or versus obligated to show up to these things. How do you balance that intention, positively, Steve?
At the end of the day, a lot of a concept that a lot of people fall back to is WIIF. What's in it for me? Why am I going to this event? If I'm going for team building, then that's my expectation. And, I can do that. If I'm just going to party, it's a very different expectation. So setting the stage, why are you going to be there? What's the whole point of this event? If it is a work event, do you serve alcohol? Don't you serve? Why are you serving alcohol? Sometimes if you make it more of a family event, that can sometimes deter people from overindulging. Not always, but sometimes. And a lot of it does have to do with people who overindulge. I know a lot of companies that, for instance, will use drink tickets. And they'll give like 2 tickets to every single person. And so if you want to drink, you get 2 drinks with this drink ticket, and that's all you get.
Right.
So you do have to watch out for a secondary market.
Well, I was just going to say, sometimes people say, well, I'm not going to drink. Right. You can have my tickets. So, there's always going to be people who might be a little sneaky. But, setting the expectations is what's important. The expectation is, yes, this is going to be a fun event. You can have a couple drinks, but we're not going overboard. That's one expectation. If it's open bar from 2:00 till 10:00 at night, that's a very different expectation. And I've had some instances that weren't just of the illegal nature, meaning, like harassment occurs or something like that, but just the uncomfortableness. People get relaxed and they overshare. I was at a dinner. It was open bar. By the time we actually sat down for dinner and the first course was served, it was salad. And the person next to me said, "No, I don't want it. Thank you." And the person next to him said, "Oh, you're not much into greens, huh?" He said, "Oh no, I've got diverticulitis. I can't eat that. If I eat that, it'll mess me up." Now, diverticulitis is very serious and it hurts and it's hard to manage. However, people don't necessarily need to know the digestive implications point by point of what would occur if you ate it. And then it gave him the license that for every course, he told us all exactly how.
Let me tell you, the gastrointestinal trauma that this steak is going to give me.
Unappetizing to some people, you kind of lose your. And this guy, he was just a little too loose, and he thought he was given permission by that one question that he shared every single. And he was lactose intolerant as well. So with the ice cream coming at the end,
I worry that I've learned too much on this podcast about this person.
But that, again, you loosen people up, and there's nothing really illegal about that conversation per se, but it certainly makes a lot of folks very uncomfortable.
you've got to ask the question, like the thing that you feel comfortable saying out loud at dinner over drinks, is that the same thing you would say at 9 a.m. Monday morning in a meeting, right? Like that, walking that line can be tricky, not just for HR to judge what is a complaint, but for individuals to figure out, how do I behave in this different context? That is a complicating factor for sure.
Yeah, especially if it's at somebody's house. That makes it even more informal.
Speaking of complex, the idea of what does voluntary mean when the CEO is inviting you to their home, Steve, right? It's like voluntary is one of those words that you think you understand until you're asked something like this. Is it really voluntary when there is an offset of power and authority?
Exactly. And some people actually do see it as a privilege to be invited to the presence. Like he's making himself, he or she is making themselves equal with the rest of the staff, and it's great that she's hosting us all. But on the other hand, there can be pressure. Oh my God, the CEO invited me to a party. How can I say no? What is she going to think of me if I say no? That causes a lot of anxiety even before you walk in the door. And if you're anxious, sometimes people will run to alcohol to reduce their anxiety. And then it causes a whole other set of challenges.
So let's look at guidance then on this particular question as we wrap this up. What guidance do you offer for organizations from HR and from the legal perspective who really are trying to build authentic engagement through these sorts of events without opening a legal can of worms?
Set expectations appropriately. Let them know clearly ahead of time what is expected, what is going to happen, what is going to occur. Definitely you need to send out those reminders. Understand that you're still with coworkers. So if you say anything, if you do anything, you have to cover your bases from a legal perspective and tell people ahead of time. These are our expectations. This is how we expect you to behave. Then it makes it a little easier. If people don't behave, you can say, well, we told you, and you went ahead and did it anyway. So we set the ground rules. You broke the ground rules. So now we've got to talk.
I try and avoid risky venues. So like the CEO has a house, and in the backyard, there's a swimming pool. Expecting people to get dressed in bathing suits to swim together as coworkers.
That's off limits.
Right. So you want to make clear boundaries, back to Steve's point. You draw a bright line to say, this is expected, this isn't, this is expected. If you can invite families, sometimes that helps.
Trust me, no one wants to see me in a bathing suit.
And sometimes it may not be appropriate. Sometimes that's inappropriate because of
absolutely
function, whatever it is. But some of you, I'd also put a clear start and finish time from 2 to 5, from 3 to 6. We're going to be doing this. So by 6, if that exists, and the HR person going around at 5:30 probably suggests that everyone's going to start wrapping up and move it along. So back to Steve's main point, bright lines, I think, make a huge difference.
Let us transition to topic 2, shall we? And this, I think, leans into some of the ancillary issues we're talking about in the first question. We're talking about protected speech at work. The line between free expression and workplace disruption is thinner than ever vis-a-vis diverticulitis, clearly. But a T-shirt or a sticker on a laptop or a comment can spark conflict, or worse, create legal exposure. So, Tom, to start us off, what types of speech are legally protected in the workplace and what isn't? I am often surprised when I hear you talk about this.
Not much is protected in the legal sense. So let's use an example. Steve is my employee, and Steve wants to talk about some political issue that's on his mind. And he starts doing so where I can generally prohibit him from doing that in the workplace because he has no free speech under the First Amendment rights. He can protest the local school budget because he wants to go. He can protest immigration issues out on his own outside of work, not identify with the workplace. He could stand at a rally. He could do anything he would, and not in his own personal life, because that's him against some organization, some governmental function, something like that. The one exception really is the National Labor Relations Act, which does provide protected speech about terms and conditions of employment. So let's say, I don't know, hard to come up with an example right off the top of my head, but a company says they impose a policy, and Steve said they impose a policy saying they're no longer going to check the brakes on the vehicles. And I know, crazy policy. And Steve says, well, when I drive one of these vehicles, I want you to do that. And starts protesting that. That's protected. It's a term and condition of work. You have to make sure the brakes work properly. That would be a valid reason for doing so.
Okay, that one of the explicit points in this question was clothing. Can an employer prohibit political dress or symbols on the job? Where is the line there? I'm imagining someone who says, I'm coming to work and I'm wearing the expected garb of the job. Maybe I'm wearing a suit. Maybe I'm wearing a jumpsuit for working in a factory, but I'm wearing maybe a pin that supports one party or one issue or another. It's tasteful, and yet I'm speaking my individuality and my belief. Where's the line there?
Just about that. The pin comes off of work. As long as you're consistent. If you're consistent, if I let Steve do it, but I don't let you, that's a problem. That's a real problem by the company. You've got to be consistent across the board and say, you can't wear, there was a case here in Massachusetts out of the Black Lives Matter movement when George Floyd was killed years ago. And there was a great deal of protest about Black Lives Matter and people wearing masks at work or T-shirts. There's a big court case in Massachusetts involving Whole Foods, the food company, and people had on masks, what have you. And the courts came back saying that no, that was not protected speech. The company could ban that.
So it sounds like my next question for Steve was around HR sort of gray zones in this area. But Steve, it sounds like, according to Tom, there aren't that many gray zones.
There really aren't. And in a way that makes it a lot easier for companies. I had my former HR manager many years ago who said, just remember your constitutional rights of free speech end the moment you walk through that front door to our office. Now you have to follow our rules. Now, he could have said it better. Indelicate. A little indelicate, but his point was 100% valid. But you also, you don't want to be so restrictive that employees perceive it as if you're stifling the culture or as if you don't trust them to make just basic conversational decisions. There's issues where, I'm in the lunchroom. I'm on my own time and having this conversation. You can't tell me what to do if I'm on my own time. And that's another challenge that I've had where, once again, it's, yes, I can tell you, even though you're not on the clock and we're not paying you for your time off, you're still sitting in our office. But you want to be specific, you want to make clear, and you want to keep the policies narrow and focused on harmful behaviors or things that are going to disrupt. If you ban all speech about everything, that can really have engagement and loyalty drop. I mean, people feel that you don't trust them, that they constantly have to censor every single thing they say. And that is not a culture you want to build. So you do have to walk, again, it's that gray area, it's that fine line between allowing people to have those water cooler conversations, which are actually extremely helpful in team building and bonding. And at the same time, saying there are certain things that are just off limits.
Well, not just that we don't want to build a culture that, says that there are where people feel stifled. I also recognize that the cases we hear about are cases around escalation when employees feel their identity is threatened. How do you recommend HR managers de-escalate or redirect sensitive conversations without sounding punitive, right? Or defensive on behalf of the company, giving themselves a bad sort of hyper-protective reputation?
Again, it depends on the circumstance. If it's a situation where you can take somebody aside and say, I need to let you know that, I overheard this conversation and it wasn't really appropriate and you need to avoid that. You don't want to publicly shame or embarrass somebody by saying, shut up, stop talking. There are circumstances, though, where you do have to nip it in the bud. If it's going down a fact of the bringing up Tom's expression of the validity of the Black Lives Matter movement. Well, rather than whether, you're advertising for it or not, is it valid? That's something you're going to have to stop quickly. You cannot wait for them to talk and take them aside.
Though there are a couple of exceptions, Pete, to be mindful of. One of them would be whistleblowers. People have speech they need to. If I'm going to report something to Steve as HR, I may need to give him more detail and more information about something than I would normally do, or he would normally tolerate within the workplace, but I have to do it for whatever reason. I overheard a conversation. I overheard whatever it is. Same thing with reporting discrimination. If I'm going to have to share information, share details that Steve might be like, I wouldn't want this in a normal setting, but I'm going to hear it now, and that's life. Because I overheard a conversation between two people that using language that was inappropriate, or using, that I would not otherwise find acceptable in the workplace, but I need to report it. So there are some sort of public policy exceptions, if you will.
Well, and I mean, it seems easy for us to say right now that the line is pretty clear, and yet, what you are describing seems like a rich tableau for someone to respond that my organization doesn't respect diverse perspectives. My organization is now suddenly a reporting culture. We all have to be super careful of everything we say because anyone is listening and they could report you at any time. I'm curious as we wrap up this particular question, and we're a little bit long on time, but what do you see as effective strategies for preserving culture while respecting that sort of diversity?
I would say, kind of repeating what I said before, make sure if you have a policy, it's narrow and it's focused on behavior that can be offensive to people. Okay. Talking about the weather, presumably, is not offensive to most people. If you start, going to, again, that's an extreme example, but if you start doing that, people are going to feel that they're being censored and you don't trust them. So you just have to make sure that it's specific. And the intent is to prevent harm, not to prevent people from talking and just having normal conversations.
The truth is, in a lot of workplace cultures, you're going to see passing comments, political of nature. It says something, did you see this? And the other person nods, or, I see, yeah, I know, I can't believe this, whatever. That's going to happen. It's when it becomes time. If I say, I'll no longer work with Steve because I don't like his politics, that's a problem. That's where companies really get concerned, is that I don't pay Steve and Tom to work, to be politically arguing. I pay them to do a job as an employer. And that's where they're trying to act to Steve's point about a fine line.
A request comes in for remote work as a health-related accommodation. It is not the first one. It will not be the last. Where does flexibility meet legal obligation? Tom, walk us through the ADA, what the ADA actually requires from employers of 15 or more. What does good faith accommodation process really look like?
So an employee comes to an employer and says, I have a disability. I have a limitation in my ability to work. The employer can ask for medical certification to support that claim. And then let's assume the employee presents that and says, I have this medical condition that makes it hard for me to get out of the house. It means I need to work from home. It means modification in my work schedule. There's a back and forth between HR and the employee over what would an accommodation look like. Historically, working from home was seen as not really feasible in most cases pre-pandemic. Post-pandemic, everybody can work from home, it appears. But
it appears. Okay.
Right. There's still issues about supervision on that, but it's much more likely that someone could come up with an accommodation saying you need to be able to work from home or remotely, and to protect, to avoid any more avoid any more hassle associated with a disability, getting to work on time, or being able to, meet other requirements of the workplace. Because if I can log on at work at time from home, maybe that's an okay part of the accommodation. I have the technology to do it. It works. And if the employer doesn't want to make that accommodation, it's up to the employer to come up with an undue hardship reason.
Okay. That's the next question. It's like you're reading my mind. What counts as undue hardship, and how is it do you recommend documenting it?
Well, you're supposed to be documenting this entire process, the back and forth between, I go to Steve as HR and say, here's my disability. He documents the process back and forth. Tom provided medical certification. We explored different options.
Mm-hmm.
We realized that there were no available options. Therefore, the undue hardship argument kicks in from the company. And we said, we can't make that accommodation, which could mean potentially I can't work there.
And that's something that everybody might just agree on.
At the most extreme end, you just say, we can't make that accommodation. If I say I have to be able to sit all day and it's a job driving UPS trucks, I can't be done.
Is there any accommodation for re-jobbing, like saying, okay, it's a UPS thing, but is there a skill that you have to do somewhere else where you can sit down? Or if you can't do that job, that's undue hardship and we're done?
It'll depend on every workplace. It might be this, I could do a job as a dispatcher. I could go sit, if it's open. The company doesn't have to fire somebody or remove someone for me to create a new job. But if there's a job open as a dispatcher and I'm qualified, I know how to do it, I know how all those things are, I could be trained how to do it, whatever, then that's fine. You could certainly do that alternative approach as well.
Okay. To Steve, all of this seems to beg for some rigor in terms of consistency and balancing consistency with flexibility. How do you balance this flexibility and consistency, especially if similar requests have been inconsistently, accepted or denied?
Consistency is the number one thing to consider. You cannot treat people differently. If you made an accommodation for one, you need to make an accommodation for another. If you didn't make an accommodation for one, but you did make an accommodation for another, and it was the same or similar accommodations, that's when you get into trouble.
You're saying that very kindly, and I just want to say, when we asked this question, for those who aren't present and watching, Tom's face went down and said, ooh. There was some real darkness from that side of the conversation.
Well, Steve recovered perfectly. Steve recovered perfectly in that one. It's always, that's the whole nature of the risk, though.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's about consistency, treating people differently for the same thing. It just begs the question, why? And that's where companies get into trouble. But I do encourage all my clients, I personally feel it's do the right thing. Do as much as you possibly can to try and accommodate this person. And there are a lot of good reasons for that. It's not just about although it is about values and ethics, you might lose a good candidate. You might lose a top-notch person because you're too resistant to give them an accommodation. Other employees may hear that somebody requested an accommodation and you said no. That can affect morale. It can affect team performance. If you don't accommodate somebody and they can't do their job effectively, then the team's not going to work. And there is also a factor of public perception. What is the public going to think if you said, no, I'm not going to spend $400 to put in a ramp in our front door so you can get inside? What's the public going to think about that? Now there are laws that do require, handicap accessibility.
But that was very much an issue before the law. I mean, we lived through that period where that was an issue.
Exactly. So, spend the money. I just encourage people, do as much as possible to make this accommodation, because you could be losing a really good person for not doing it.
Do either of you have, just right off the dome, surprisingly creative accommodations that your client organizations have undertaken to keep great employees who need a little bit more?
I did have one recent interactive dialogue with somebody where they had some emotional challenges that they needed to work from home, and they wanted to work from home full time. That was impossible because this person was client facing and they needed to meet with clients, but they couldn't do it remotely. They had to be, given the nature of the job, it had to be done in person. It could not be done remotely. So again, it was impossible for us to say, no, you can work full time. But what we came up with is that they would group their client meetings to have them as much as possible on either 1 or 2 days. So if they couldn't come in on that one day, and they were all grouped together, the company would be able to find somebody else to do those intakes, to do those interviews. So instead of not being able to do it for 5 days, okay, so if only just pick 2 days that you're going to see all the clients.
The rest of the time you can work from home.
The rest of the time you can work from home. It used to be they would just schedule clients randomly depending on when they were available. Now they just have to focus. And the person was totally okay with that. The manager was totally okay with that. And so far it's been 2 months and I'm here. It's working very well.
I think that's that's the nut of the question is, how far can companies go to accommodate great people, right? If the intention is to make a safe and welcoming workplace for people despite differences, then how far can they go to do this if they want to? And are there any sort of limitations to making it work? Tom?
The law carries this thing called the direct threat. So if somebody does an accommodation, there's a famous court case years ago. This guy wanted to work on an oil rig platform. He had already worked for the same company for years on the land. He wanted to go out and work on the platform, but the platform was full of certain chemicals. The company had to test people to see if those chemicals were okay. Well, this person was allergic to some of those chemicals. So they told him, you can't go out here. We can make no accommodation because it would mean basically closing the platform down to do so. And so he said, no, that's my choice. I'll do that. And the company, saying, no, we won't do it. We can't do it. He sued them and the company won in court. So it poses a direct threat to that person is one thing, but those cases are hard to prove.
Yeah, it seems like there's also a hard, clear line. Right. For those
and medical evidence
cases.
says this is what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And as opposed to the more nuanced cases of someone saying, well, we can and we can't do something.
Sure. Amy has a question in the chat. Do accommodations have to be permanent or only temporary? Steve?
I was going to say that completely depends on the nature. Someone can be temporarily disabled and need a temporary accommodation. Other people are permanently disabled, so they would need a permanent one. So it really depends on what the request is, what the ADA specific request is.
And someone's disability may evolve over time.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
They may start off with, some mild issue and it becomes much more serious later on. It becomes more limiting, so therefore they have to modify the accommodation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It's really keep the door open to the discussion.
Right. Well, it's interesting as we talk through all of these questions. I think the overall theme that carries us through is this idea of consistency and documentation, right? As long as guidelines are pursued consistently within the realm of the legal obligations that we have, you can do an awful lot to create a warm and welcoming and safe space for everyone who works at your organization.
And I would say you should. I'm just going to throw that in.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
Because even though the ADA kicks in at 15, your state law in your state may have a lower threshold, like here in Massachusetts, it's 6. Some other state may be 10, 15, 5, whatever. So you want to be mindful of that. And most of these laws are pretty complementary Federal law is more detailed, obviously, but state laws, the intent is exactly what Steve was saying.
Well, thank you both so much. Again, we have gone over time, but great questions, great responses. Thank you, everybody, for hanging out with us on this fine Tuesday webinar of Human Solutions. Once again, AIM members, reach out to the HR helpline, 800-470-6277, or helpline@aimnet.org. Email requests will be responded to within 24 hours. And it may be Tom. It may be the famous, internet famous Tom Jones writing that email. As always, links in the show notes. I've got a lot of links for you. I got links to laws. I got links to accommodations. I got links to undue hardship. You want it, you got it. It's in the show notes. Scroll down in the notes on the podcast app. If you're not subscribing to the podcast, we've got loads of past episodes dealing with many of these issues with our fantastic AIM experts. And we would love you to check us out there anywhere podcasts are served. On behalf of Steve Pangione and Tom Jones, I'm Pete Wright, and we'll see you next month right here on Human Solutions.
Thank you, Pete.